56 rebels. Are you disappointed, though, that your party leadership and the majority of your colleagues did not support calls for a ceasefire tonight?
I'm more disappointed on something that's a bit more fundamental than that. I've always believed, and I've advocated this for all the time I've been in Parliament, that when it comes to an issue around war and peace, people's lives, there should be a free vote so that people can vote with their conscience, because it is a matter of conscience for me. And so I was disappointed that Keir didn't allow that. And that's why a lot of people, as you say, 56 people voted for the ceasefire, because that's what they honestly believed in. But there were many others that I think voted out of party loyalty because of, as they do, or the whips do their work to encourage people to vote for the party line. And I think many of them felt really not happy about that. And I think that then provokes a reaction. It's not strong leadership if you're forcing people to do things that they don't believe in. And I hope the lesson from this is, when this is so fundamental, it is a matter of conscience, you allow people to exercise their judgment in that way. When we had the vote on Syria, the bombing of Syria, we did give people a free vote, and they exercised their right to vote on the basis of their conscience. So I think that's one of the more fundamental lessons that should be learned from tonight. And then we can have the debate about whether people support pauses or whether they support a ceasefire much more honestly than having the sort of party whip used.
Let's have that conversation then, because the point that Keir Starmer makes is a reasonable one. If there is a ceasefire now, nothing fundamentally changes. It leaves Hamas in power, and that is not conducive to long-term peace. What's your response to that argument, John?
I don't think that's accurate, and we need to learn from history around the development of ceasefires. The reason people were concerned about voting for a pause is what a pause does. It just gives a few hours of relief where people can maybe get some food or water, and then this killing starts all over again, and it never progresses further. And if we look at the history of the development of ceasefires in the past, it's always difficult. What usually happens is you announce you're going for a ceasefire, the mediators come together, they then look at the ways in which that ceasefire can be developed, and usually one of the first steps is trying to get an act of goodwill on all sides. One of the acts of goodwill that we've been arguing for, along with the families of the hostages, is actually the exchange of hostages for prisoners. And again, the families have argued for all the hostages for all the prisoners held by Israel. It's getting Qatar involved, Turkey involved, Egypt involved on one side, and then the other side, the US, because they're the most influential powers with regard to Israel, but also the UK have got a role here because of our historic role. Then what happens is you do eventually, amongst others, you get the belligerents together, the belligerent parties, and you then look for a longer-term peace process. And I think that's what people were looking for in this instance.
That would entail, at least for the short term, probably the medium term too, that would entail Hamas staying in power in Gaza, wouldn't it? We have to be clear about that.
Well, the reality is this, isn't it? And the reality is, no matter how abhorrent you feel about some of the parties into that includes Hamas. This is a terrorist organization we're talking about. Eventually, if you want a ceasefire, you have to engage in some form of dialogue with them, most probably through mediators. We've got to learn from what's happened in our own history with regard to what happened in Ireland and the IRA.
But it's not the same, is it? Because the IRA wasn't sworn to the destruction of the United Kingdom in the way that Hamas is sworn to the destruction of Israel.
They were sworn to the destruction of the Northern Ireland state because they wanted a united Ireland.
They didn't want. If the IRA had wanted to wipe the UK off the map in the way that Hamas does with Israel, there wouldn't have been the middle ground for negotiations.
Well, take other examples. I think the IRA is one example where an organisation has been designated a terrorist organisation. Eventually, you have to get into negotiations and you resolve a peaceful matter. It's the same as happened in Vietnam and every other. If you look at every other historical example, the reality is you have to negotiate, and a ceasefire will come at some stage. The issue now is how long will it take in Gaza and how many more lives, civilian lives, will be lost. So it's trying to move towards that. It's trying to move towards that inevitable process of securing.
John, do you really see a situation where Israel and Hamas can just peacefully coexist? The whole raison d'etre of Hamas,
No, I don't.
The whole purpose is
that.
That's what I'm getting at. My view would be that while Hamas are in power, there cannot be peace because their whole reason for existing is the destruction of the state of Israel.
I don't necessarily see Hamas surviving in the form it is now, because I think if you look at the potential of the influence of the Arab states in particular, I can see a development on where it may be part of the negotiating process that Hamas is removed, no longer has the support of those powers. And on that basis, you look for another way forward. You've got to remember why we're in this situation is what happened 30 years ago when the Oslo Accord and the development of peace process was taking place then. People like Netanyahu were undermining that process. We saw the assassination of Rabin. We saw the isolation of Arafat. And as a result of that, the PLO then were disabled to a large extent, and Hamas filled that vacuum. If we're not careful, if Israel thinks they can defeat Hamas militarily, what you'll find is that vacuum will be filled, and it might be filled by even worse than Hamas.
I think you're saying
that's why you need to start the process off now of negotiating a future. The reason Hamas exists is because the actually political solutions were failed, and they were failed as a result, I'm afraid, by some influences, of Netanyahu in particular, within Israel.
So I think you're agreeing that Hamas ultimately needs to go, but you're saying it can't be achieved through military action.
I think Hamas, my own view is Hamas will have to go. And I think there's a recognition amongst a number of the Arab states that has to happen. But it can't be done on a military basis, because the fear is if you seek to defeat Hamas militarily, you'll ensure that there is a build-up of such resentment because of the civilian casualties. And we're at 11,000 now. We could be at 20,000 soon if we're not careful.
And I would agree that is appalling. Sorry? I would agree with you that is appalling and a horror.
But the point I'm making is you will ensure that the next generation coming through will actually possibly be more terrorist inclined than even Hamas.
Yeah, but clearly violence fosters extremism. That said, John, I would say violence fosters extremism. I don't agree with the way that Israel has gone about things. I don't agree that that's in Israel's interest either. What I do think is in Israel's interest is a surgical, targeted military campaign designed to take out Hamas. Not the indiscriminate bombing that we've seen recently, not the needs to do far more to protect civilians, but I would defend the right of Israel to use force specifically against Hamas in a way that, of course, a ceasefire would prevent.
But that, I'm afraid we're too late for that. We're too late for that because Israel has gone along the path, unfortunately, of indiscriminate bombing. They've gone along the path of attacking facilities that are many would be accused of war crimes, and there is no way at the moment.
That could change without a complete cessation of violence like what you're calling for.
I don't believe that actually Israel would accept that at this point, because I think they're unless there's severe influence on them, I don't think they're willing to pull back. That's why the role of the UK saying we're willing to assist in the development of a ceasefire along with the US, I think could be quite influential. I actually do think that the role of the Arab states, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, could play an influential role amongst the Palestinians. It isn't just about influence Hamas, it's about influencing all the various Palestinian groups to enable them then to come to an agreement with.
But in terms of a ceasefire, Hamas, both sides would need to agree to it. Israel would need to agree to it. Hamas would need to agree to it. Do you see a situation ever, John? Do you really see a situation here where Hamas agrees to down arms against Israel?
I think the withdrawal of support, or the threat of withdrawal of support from those Arab states that have supported them up till now, could force them to the table. And that's what we've seen in other peace negotiations, where external influences demonstrate to the belligerent parties, if you like, that the support is no longer there to enable them to continue on. And then you find a route out for them in forms of decommissioning.
But their main supporter, sorry to jump in, their main supporter is Iran, which has absolutely no interest at all in peace between the Palestinian people and Israel.
Well, there's other supporters there as well, to be honest. But in addition to that, I actually don't think Iran wants to see the Middle East go up in flames, because they will be put at risk themselves. And in addition to that, you have other influential players that do not want to see their own people rising up as a result of their failure to do anything about restoring peace in Palestine.
John, you were very clear in the description of Hamas. You called them a terror group. I didn't even have to ask you about it. Why do you think some of your colleagues, some of your friends, people like Jeremy Corbyn, find it so difficult to use that language about Hamas?
Well, that's for them. I actually think the discussion around issues around why you call this and that are not the key issues. The key issue for me is there are 11,000 dead people out there that have been killed. There are 4,500 children. That's not the issue. And I actually do think it reduces the discussion to something that's not serious. What we've got to concentrate on now is, how do we achieve a ceasefire? How do we use the UK's influence, working with the UN, who've called for a ceasefire, working with countries like France, working with other partners? How do we use that influence to bring the various parties to the table to secure a ceasefire and to end the killing? And that's our role.
I disagree with you on that. I do think language matters, John. Just to be very clear, you have no qualms calling Hamas terrorists.
Well, I have done all the way through. The acts that they took on October the 7th was a terrorist act, wasn't it? And therefore, it was a terrorism. But at the same time, let me be absolutely clear, I actually do think that some of the actions that Israel have taken are contrary, absolutely contrary to the Rome Statute, which, for example, on Article 8, Article 8 of the Rome Statute says very, very clearly you should not use weapons that are inherently indiscriminate in their effect. And that's what the bombing has done. It also says, Article 8, that you should not use starvation or the deprivation of the means of life as a weapon in that way. You should not also, in Article 8, force people out of their land, out of their homes. So I have condemned Israel's actions as well. And that's why, as you move towards a ceasefire, you've got to be even-handed in the judgments that you make.